My name is Gaston Illanes. I'm an assistant professor of economics here at Northwestern. I've taught Econometrics in MMSS for the last 8 years or so. Now I'm transitioning to supervising your theses, which is the final project for graduating for MMSS. Econometrics is, for me, where the rubber hits the road for economics. So economics has a lot of theoretical models. You're going to spend a lot of time thinking about, oh, what would happen if this, or what would happen if that. But when you want to go out to the real world, it's not enough to think, oh, prices are going to go up. People are going to want to know by how much. Or, the effect of increasing the minimum wage is going to be to increase unemployment. Okay, but by how much? We have tons of how much questions in the world. They're probably the most meaningful questions, and econometrics is the place where economics gets to answer how much type of questions. We're going to give you a myriad of tools to try to leverage data to answer those questions. And the key thing is understanding that every tool comes with a set of assumptions, learning those assumptions, learning when they're more reasonable and when they're less reasonable, so that you can become a judicious user of statistics.